In the city of Königsberg, once the heart of East Prussia, a child was born who would one day stand among the most fearless thinkers of the 20th century. Her name was Hannah Arendt, and from the beginning she was destined to question everything. She was born on October 14, 1906, into a world that still believed women should listen, not speak, obey, not think. But Hannah, sharp-eyed, restless, impossible to tame, was never going to fit quietly into the mold carved out for her. Even as a child, she refused to accept the boundaries others called natural. Where adults demanded obedience, she demanded explanation. Where teachers taught dogma, she asked questions that pierced through certainty like light through fog. A home of ideas and tension. Her family belonged to the educated German-Jewish middle class, cultured yet precariously positioned in a society where anti-Semitism simmered beneath civility. Her father, Paul Arendt, was an engineer, passionate about social justice and politics, with a gentle but rational spirit. Her mother, Martha, was a fiercely independent woman who instilled in Hannah both discipline and defiance. When Paul died of syphilis in 1913, Hannah was only 7. The loss left a void that she would later describe not as tragedy, but as the beginning of loneliness. A solitude that would become her lifelong companion and the ground from which her thought would grow. Martha, strong-willed and politically engaged, raised Hannah to think for herself. When teachers demanded rote memorization, Martha told her daughter to trust her mind. When other children bowed to authority, Hannah stood apart, often in trouble for questioning the rules. "If I am to obey," she would say even as a child, "I must understand." It was not arrogance, it was necessity. For Hannah Arendt, even as a girl, thought was the only true refuge from the chaos of the world. Growing up amid ruins. The First World War erupted when she was 8 years old. Her home city, like all of Europe, was plunged into fear and deprivation, rations, hunger, propaganda. Hannah watched the machinery of war twist truth into lies, morality into obedience. While other children played, she observed, she saw how words could be used to blind a people, how crowds could cheer for their own destruction. When the war ended, Germany was a broken nation, humiliated, impoverished, and seething with resentment. The air itself seemed poisoned by disillusionment. The empire had fallen, the old order collapsed. It was into this world of confusion and instability that Hannah stepped as a young girl on the threshold of womanhood, and she began to read. A world of books became her sanctuary. She devoured Kant, Goethe, and the Greek tragedians before most children her age could name them. She found in literature not comfort, but confrontation, a way to think the world rather than escape it. By her teenage years, she was already studying philosophy on her own, fascinated by questions of meaning, freedom, and the moral responsibilities of human beings. Her teachers admired her brilliance, but warned her mother that Hannah was too intellectual for her own good. Her classmates alternated between awe and irritation at her confidence. She did not seek approval. At 16, she was already arguing that truth was not something one received, but something one fought for, the spirit of defiance. This defiance was not rebellion for rebellion's sake. It was rooted in conviction. Hannah's mother taught her that silence in the face of injustice was complicity. When anti-Semitic remarks were made in class, Hannah stood up and walked out, refusing to be part of it. When a teacher told her to apologize for disrespect, she refused, insisting that respect must be earned. It was her first lesson in courage, the courage to stand alone. The awakening of thought. But even in her youth, Arendt's defiance had a reflective side. She did not only resist, she sought to understand. She began to notice the strange duality of the human condition, how good people could participate in evil, how obedience could become blindness, how ordinary life could conceal monstrous potential. These questions would later haunt her for decades, culminating in her exploration of the banality of evil. But in those early years, they were still seeds, unformed, burning questions that had no place in the simple moralities of childhood. A voice emerging. When she entered high school, her reputation preceded her. Teachers admired her intellect but feared her sharpness. She debated everything, from politics to theology, fearlessly, relentlessly. The idea of authority fascinated her. Why do people obey? What makes one person's word command, another's silence? One teacher, overwhelmed by her constant challenges, reportedly said, "You, Fräulein Arendt, should remember you are a young lady." To which she replied, without hesitation, "And you should remember I am a human being." That was Hannah Arendt, even at 17, brilliant, unyielding, already incapable of accepting any identity smaller than humanity itself. The threshold of a mind. By the time she prepared to leave Königsberg, the restless girl had become a young woman, certain of one thing, that she would devote her life to thinking. Philosophy, she decided, was not a profession. It was a form of existence. She would not live quietly, she would live consciously. She could not yet know that her pursuit of truth would one day lead her into exile, into scandal, and into the heart of history's darkest century. But even then, as she stood on the threshold of her adult life, one principle already guided her: to refuse to think is the beginning of evil. The girl who had refused to be silent was about to meet the man who would both awaken and wound her, the philosopher who would shape her mind and break her heart. In 1924, at just 18 years old, Hannah Arendt left her hometown of Königsberg and boarded a train to Marburg University, a quiet German town nestled among the hills, famous for its medieval architecture and its equally ancient air of intellectual seriousness. She carried with her a small suitcase, a few books, and a hunger that nothing in Königsberg could satisfy: the hunger to think freely. The Germany she entered was no longer the empire of her childhood. The Weimar Republic was fragile, haunted by inflation, humiliation, and anger. Streets swarmed with veterans, jobless and bitter. Political extremism was rising, ideologies colliding. But Hannah, still young and idealistic, was not yet consumed by politics. Her faith, if she had one, was in philosophy and in the human capacity for reason. What she found in Marburg would transform her life forever. The philosopher and the student Marburg's philosophy department was small, but within its halls taught one of the most electrifying minds in Europe, Martin Heidegger. He was in his mid-30s, brilliant, intense, magnetic. Students whispered about his lectures as if they were revelations. He didn't merely teach philosophy, he performed it, pulling language apart, searching for truth in the spaces between words. When Hannah first heard him speak, she felt something ignite. Heidegger's words did not sound like the other professors', dry recitations of past ideas, but like a storm of thought itself. He spoke of being, the mystery of existence, the act of being alive, as though he had glimpsed its secret. In his presence, philosophy ceased to be a discipline and became a form of passion. And for Hannah, it was impossible not to be swept away. She later wrote that Heidegger awakened my thinking. What she did not write, but everyone would later know, was that he also awakened her heart, a forbidden love. He was married with children. She was his student, barely 20. Their affair was dangerous, secret, and, inevitably, doomed. Yet for Hannah, it was not merely an infatuation. It was the meeting of two souls bound by thought. In the evenings, she would climb the steep paths to his office. They spoke of Aristotle, Augustine, Kant, and of nothing less than existence itself. Heidegger told her that thinking was the most intimate of human acts, that to truly think was to love. Hannah listened, enraptured. For a time, she believed him. Their letters from those years, later published, are charged with intellectual and emotional intensity. "You are the passion of my thinking," he wrote. "You are my secret homeland," she replied with devotion and brilliance, refusing to be merely the student, insisting on being a mind in her own right. But the imbalance was there from the beginning. He was the master, she the disciple, and behind the beauty of their encounter lurked a shadow that would one day swallow the world. Thinking as a way of being under Heidegger's influence, Hannah plunged deeper into philosophy than ever before. She studied ancient Greek, theology, and metaphysics, but what fascinated her most was the act of thinking itself, the solitude of the mind confronting reality. Unlike Heidegger, however, she never lost sight of the human world. Where he sought the mystery of being in abstraction, she remained tethered to experience, to the realm of people and politics. Even then, her difference from him was visible. Heidegger's thinking drew inward, Hannah's reached outward. His mind sought meaning in silence, hers demanded speech, dialogue, publicness. It was as if, even in love, she was preparing to depart from him. The weight of existence. At Marburg, Hannah also began to encounter the darker undercurrents of German society. The quiet anti-Semitism that had always lingered was becoming louder, more confident. Posters in the streets spoke of national renewal. Students whispered political slogans between lectures. Hannah, as a Jewish woman, could feel the walls tightening, even if the world still pretended not to notice. Philosophy offered her no refuge from this reality. The same professors who spoke of ethics and truth ignored the growing hatred around them. Heidegger himself, aloof, enigmatic, never mentioned politics in their conversations. She wondered if thought could ever be truly innocent. These questions, small at first, would grow to dominate her later life. Could thinking exist without responsibility? Could philosophers retreat into abstraction while the world burned? The first departure. After a year, the affair with Heidegger ended abruptly. Perhaps his conscience stirred, or perhaps he feared scandal. Either way, he cut off their meetings. Hannah was devastated. She left Marburg and transferred to the University of Heidelberg, where she continued her studies under Karl Jaspers, another great philosopher, but one very different from Heidegger. Jaspers was humane, warm, and deeply moral. Where Heidegger's genius was seductive but isolating, Jaspers' intellect was open and kind. Under his guidance, Hannah found not passion, but clarity. She began to write her doctoral dissertation on St. Augustine's concept of love, exploring how human affection can both unite and enslave. In Augustine's paradoxes, she recognized her own experience. Love as freedom and captivity, as light and shadow. Seeds of the future. In Heidelberg, she found her balance again, but the memory of Heidegger lingered like a ghost. She would never fully renounce him, not even decades later, after his allegiance to the Nazi regime became known. Their bond, born in philosophy, would haunt her all her life. But out of this storm of passion and betrayal, something powerful had been born. The foundation of a mind unlike any other. Hannah Arendt was no longer a brilliant student. She was becoming a thinker in her own right, one who would not merely interpret philosophy, but confront the darkest realities of human history. And soon, those realities would no longer be abstract. The Germany she loved was about to fall into madness. The young woman who had fallen in love with thought would soon have to decide whether thought itself could survive evil. In the quiet, grey evenings of Marburg, the corridors of the university emptied quickly. But one young woman remained behind. She walked alone through the rain-slick streets, clutching her books, her heart divided between reason and longing. Her name was Hannah Arendt, and behind one of those ancient wooden doors waited Martin Heidegger, her professor, her secret, her impossible love. Their affair was as dangerous as it was intoxicating. To those outside, it was unthinkable. A young Jewish student and a married professor, a man of towering intellect and growing fame. But to Hannah, Heidegger was not merely a teacher, he was the embodiment of thought itself, the man who had taught her that philosophy could burn. The flame of thought. They met in his office, a small room lined with books and filled with the scent of tobacco and rain-soaked paper. Their conversations were like jewels, sharp and intimate. Heidegger would speak of being, the silent mystery at the core of existence, and Hannah would answer not as a student, but as an equal, challenging his abstractions with her clarity. For her, these meetings were revelations. He gave words to the wonder she had always felt, that to think was the deepest act of being alive, but slowly the intellectual became personal. Thought turned into touch, and their secret became something more than philosophy. In later years, Hannah would write that thinking and loving are not the same, but they both refuse banality. With Heidegger, she experienced both the elevation and the danger of that refusal. Love in the shadows. Their affair unfolded like a poem written in invisible ink, intense, coded, hidden from the world. Heidegger's letters called her mein kleines Wilds, my little wild one. He saw in her youth not innocence, but brilliance, the fire of a mind that refused to kneel. For Hannah, his attention was intoxicating but never simple. She admired him, loved him, but she also saw his weaknesses, his hunger for admiration, his aloofness, his worship of destiny. She was drawn to his mind but wary of his authority. In his lectures, he spoke of freedom and authenticity, yet he demanded devotion and secrecy. The contradiction was not lost on her. But she was young, and love, when intertwined with philosophy, can disguise contradictions as mysteries. They met rarely, cautiously, walking in the forest, exchanging letters, speaking in riddles that mixed metaphysics with affection. She knew it could not last. He belonged to another life, a wife, 2 children, a position that required respectability. She was still a student, still forming her place in the world, and yet she believed that what they shared transcended scandal. It was not mere romance. It was Erfahrung, experience in its purest existential sense. A world turning dark, but outside their secret world, history was beginning to twist into nightmare. The 1920s were ending, and Germany was changing. The collapse of the economy had unleashed chaos. Extremist movements filled the streets. Nationalist rhetoric grew louder, anti-Semitic pamphlets circulated openly, and crowds began chanting about a pure Germany. Hannah could not ignore it. Her Jewishness, something she had once regarded as merely cultural, was becoming a mark of danger. Heidegger, meanwhile, remained silent on politics, absorbed in his philosophy. When Hannah tried to speak to him about the growing hatred, he waved it away, saying that politics was a distraction from the higher calling of thought. It was the first fissure in their bond. For Hannah, thought and life could never be separated. For Heidegger, they were worlds apart. The division between philosophy and responsibility, between the thinker and the citizen, would later become the wound that defined her life's work. The break. Their affair ended abruptly, as all impossible loves do. Heidegger, fearing exposure and scandal, withdrew. Some say his wife found out, others believe he simply tired of the danger. Whatever the reason, the silence that followed was devastating. Hannah, heartbroken but defiant, left Marburg and transferred to Heidelberg to study under Karl Jaspers, a philosopher known not for mysticism but for humanity. If Heidegger had taught her the power of thought, Jaspers would teach her the ethics of it. Still, she could not forget. She carried Heidegger with her, not as a man, but as a question. How could someone so brilliant be so blind to moral reality? That question would haunt her long after Heidegger joined the Nazi Party in 1933. The man who had taught her to think freely would become a servant to tyranny. And yet, even then, Hannah would never renounce him completely. Their correspondence, interrupted by war and exile, would one day resume. Decades later, after Auschwitz, after the world's descent into horror, she would still write to him. Not in forgiveness, but in an unbreakable recognition of what he had awakened in her. The cost of awakening. The young woman who had once climbed the hills of Marburg to her teacher's office was no longer naive. She had learned the beauty and danger of thought, the ecstasy and the betrayal of love. She had discovered that intellect could seduce, and that truth, if not guarded by conscience, could become monstrous. As she wrote her dissertation in Heidelberg, Hannah Arendt was transforming. Her philosophy was beginning to take shape, not as a search for eternal being, but as a demand to face the world as it is, with all its cruelty and possibility. Soon, history would come for her in full force. The philosopher of freedom would become the refugee of tyranny. The forbidden love that had awakened her mind was over. Now she would have to face the question that would define her forever. What happens when thinking falls silent in the face of evil? By 1933, the storm that Hannah Arendt had long sensed in the air finally broke. Adolf Hitler had become Chancellor of Germany. The flags of a new order hung from buildings. The streets throbbed with chants, drums, and the synchronized rhythm of boots. The republic that had promised freedom collapsed overnight into a machinery of obedience. For Hannah Arendt, then 26, it was the end of a world and the beginning of her exile. The collapse of thought. In the cafes and universities of Germany, silence spread faster than fear. Professors who had once lectured on ethics and freedom raised their hands in salute. Scholars purged their Jewish colleagues. Newspapers printed lies so outrageous that truth itself seemed to dissolve. And amid that silence came one betrayal that cut deeper than all others. Martin Heidegger, the man who had once awakened her mind to the beauty of thinking, the man she had loved, stood before a cheering crowd at the University of Freiburg and declared his loyalty to the Führer. He donned the Nazi party badge. He ordered that Jewish faculty be expelled. He proclaimed that the Führer himself and he alone is the present and future of Germany. To Hannah, it was as if philosophy itself had collapsed. The man who had taught her that thinking was the highest act of freedom had surrendered his mind to power. The betrayal was not personal, it was civilizational. If even philosophers could abandon conscience, what hope was left for truth? The moment of decision. Hannah had no illusions about what would come next. As a Jewish intellectual and a woman who refused silence, she was in danger. Yet rather than flee immediately, she chose to act. She began working secretly to document Nazi propaganda against Jews, collecting leaflets and evidence for the German Zionist organization. It was an act of courage and of defiance. The Gestapo arrested her soon after. She was detained and interrogated, accused of espionage. She knew that many who entered Nazi prisons never came out again, but somehow, through luck and nerve, she was released. Years later, she would say, with her characteristic dry calm, "I was no heroine. I simply thought it better to do something than nothing." That decision, to act, to resist even when hope seemed impossible, was the seed of her later philosophy. From that moment on, she would no longer trust abstract thought unless it faced reality directly. Exile. In the autumn of 1933, Hannah fled Germany. She crossed the border into Czechoslovakia, then continued to Geneva, and finally arrived in Paris. There, she joined the swelling tide of Jewish refugees, intellectuals, artists, workers, all stripped of nation, home, and legal identity. She was stateless now, without papers, without protection. She would remain so for nearly 2 decades. In Paris, she began again. She learned the language, worked for Jewish organizations, helped resettle refugees, and wrote essays that few would publish. She met Walter Benjamin, the melancholic philosopher and cultural critic whose friendship would mark her deeply. Together, they discussed Kafka, exile, and the strange loneliness of those who had lost their place in the world. Benjamin, like her, was brilliant and displaced. He would later die fleeing the Nazis. His death would haunt her forever. A world without rights. During those Paris years, Arendt's philosophy took shape from the texture of her own life. She lived among the stateless, people stripped not only of homes, but of the right to have rights. They existed outside the law, invisible to governments, neither citizens nor foreigners, ghosts of political existence. From their suffering, she saw a new kind of evil emerging, one that came not from cruelty, but from indifference, from the bureaucratic machinery that erased individuality. She began to understand that the greatest danger was not hatred, but thoughtlessness. Years later, she would write in the Origins of Totalitarianism, "The calamity of the rightless is not that they are oppressed, but that nobody wants even to oppress them." This insight, the moral void created by the destruction of citizenship, was born from the streets of Paris, from her own hunger, fear, and persistence, love and survival. In Paris, Hannah also met Heinrich Blücher, a German poet and former communist who had fled the same darkness. He was rough, passionate, and politically astute, everything Heidegger was not. Blücher treated her not as a student or disciple, but as a comrade. They fell in love and built a partnership based not on hierarchy, but on equality. Heinrich became her companion in exile, her anchor in chaos. Together they survived by teaching, translating, and helping other refugees. When Germany invaded France in 1940, both were interned. Hannah at the infamous Gurs detention camp in the Pyrenees, where thousands of Jewish refugees were held behind barbed wire. She described it later not as a prison, but as organized helplessness. Yet even there, her will did not break. With the help of friends, she escaped the camp, walking for days through occupied France. From there, with false papers, she and Heinrich fled across the Pyrenees to Spain, then to Lisbon, and finally, after months of waiting for a visa, to New York. She arrived in America in 1941 with a single suitcase, no money, no country, and no certainty except this: she had survived. The birth of a new voice. The exile had changed her. She no longer believed in the innocence of intellectuals, nor in the safety of ideas. She had seen how words could be twisted into lies, how obedience could destroy nations, how thinking could become an alibi for inaction. In New York, she began to write not just as a philosopher, but as a witness. She had crossed the darkness and seen the void where thought had died. Now she would dedicate her life to rebuilding it. She once wrote, "In the darkest times, we have the right to expect some illumination. It comes less from theories and more often from the uncertain, flickering, and often weak light that some men and women will kindle in their lives and works." Hannah Arendt had become that light, flickering, human, but unyielding. The girl who had refused to be silent, the lover who had believed in thought, the refugee who had crossed continents. She was ready to confront the monsters of the modern age, not with weapons, but with words. The next years would bring her masterpiece, The Origins of Totalitarianism, a book born from exile, written out of pain and destined to make the world see itself anew. When Hannah Arendt arrived in New York City in 1941, she was 35 years old, penniless, stateless, and carrying the weight of a Europe that had destroyed itself. She had fled arrest, crossed borders illegally, escaped a concentration camp, and crossed the Atlantic with forged documents. She had lost her language, her homeland and many of her friends, and yet she had not lost her mind. If anything, exile sharpened it. She had seen what happens when thought collapses, when people surrender the burden of judgment. Now, in this new country, she would dedicate herself to understanding how that had happened and whether it could happen again. A refugee among refugees. New York was not the world she had left behind. It was loud, bustling, indifferent. Refugees like her filled cheap apartments and smoky cafes on the Upper West Side, speaking German to one another in half-whispered nostalgia. They were the displaced intelligentsia of Europe. Poets, professors, artists, now reduced to selling translations, teaching night classes, surviving as ghosts in a foreign land. Hannah lived among them, teaching German, writing articles for small exile journals, helping others find work or housing. She understood their despair, but refused to drown in it. "We lost our world," she would later write, "but not our ability to begin anew." To be stateless was to live without legal protection, without a name recognized by the world. But Arendt refused to accept victimhood. She wore her displacement like armor, determined to transform it into thought, relearning the world. At first, English felt like a cage. She spoke it with precision, but never with ease. "Every word," she said, "is a translation of a thought that began elsewhere." Yet she also saw in this linguistic exile an opportunity to rebuild her world from scratch. In the refugee cafes, she met fellow intellectuals, many of them Jewish émigrés, who debated politics late into the night. Among them were Hans Jonas, Karl Löwith, and Walter Benjamin's surviving friends. Benjamin himself was gone. He had taken his life while fleeing Nazi Spain. His death haunted Hannah. She would later write of him with reverence. He remained true to his thinking, which means he preferred to die rather than live a lie. In those first years in America, Hannah became part of the New School for Social Research, a haven for European refugees. There she found community and the intellectual space to think again. The Origins of Totalitarianism. Out of her exile, a question began to take shape, one that would define her life's work. How did a civilization that prized culture, art, and philosophy give birth to totalitarianism? She began researching the roots of modern tyranny, tracing them through history like a detective examining a crime scene. The result, published in 1951, was her first major book, The Origins of Totalitarianism. It was not a dry analysis, it was an autopsy of the 20th century. She dissected how anti-Semitism, imperialism, and bureaucracy combined to create a new kind of domination, one that didn't merely oppress, but sought to annihilate the individual altogether. Her thesis was shocking. Totalitarianism was not a barbaric accident, but the logical outcome of Western civilization's own structures. Its obsession with conformity, its worship of power, its craving for certainty. She wrote, "The totalitarian phenomenon demonstrates that human beings can be made superfluous." The book was both history and warning. It told the world that evil did not appear out of nowhere. It was born of ordinary neglect, of institutions that valued order over humanity. The voice of the stateless. The Origins of Totalitarianism made Arendt a name again, not as a refugee, but as one of the most original political thinkers of her generation. Yet she never forgot where her insight had come from. She had lived as one of the superfluous people, stripped of rights, surviving only because chance had favored her. She had seen what it meant to lose the right to have rights. For Arendt, this phrase became central. The idea that political belonging, not freedom, not happiness, but the right to appear as a person before others, was the foundation of human dignity. She wrote with the authority of one who had suffered what she described. She spoke not for herself, but for millions who had no voice. In exile, Arendt had become something more than a philosopher. She had become a witness, building a new life. In New York, she also built a home with Heinrich Blücher, her partner from Paris. They married quietly in 1940 and remained together until his death. Their love was one of equals, two exiles who had both escaped annihilation and shared an unspoken gratitude for survival. Their apartment became a gathering place for students, writers, and refugees. They cooked simple meals, argued about politics, and read poetry late into the night. For all her fame, Arendt lived modestly, uninterested in status or wealth. When asked years later whether she considered herself an American philosopher, she replied with her wry half-smile, "I am not a philosopher. I am a political thinker. I am concerned with the world, not with the self." Between two worlds, despite her growing recognition, she never felt entirely at home in America. She admired its democratic spirit but distrusted its conformity. She loved its energy but found its optimism naive. She was too European for the Americans, too American for the exiles. And yet, this in-between state gave her vision. As a stateless person, she saw the world from its edges, where illusions die first. She understood how fragile civilization was, how easily freedom could vanish behind bureaucratic smiles and polished speeches. The meaning of freedom. Through her teaching and writing, Arendt began to redefine freedom itself. It was not, she insisted, merely the absence of restraint. True freedom was action, the capacity to begin, to do something new, to appear before others and speak one's truth. She called it natality, the human capacity for new beginnings. It was her answer to despair, her defiance of the horrors she had seen. "The miracle that saves the world," she wrote, "is the fact that it is born anew with every child." For a woman who had lost everything, this was a radical statement of hope. The stateless refugee from Königsberg had rebuilt herself into a thinker who redefined the century. But her greatest test was yet to come. In the 1960s, Hannah Arendt would return to Europe not as a victim but as an observer to witness one of the most important trials in history. There, face to face with the man who had organized the machinery of death, she would give the world a phrase that still echoes today: the banality of evil. By 1951, Hannah Arendt was no longer simply a refugee or an émigré intellectual. She was the author of a book that would redefine how the world thought about power, evil, and human fragility. The Origins of Totalitarianism appeared in the aftermath of war, in a world still dazed by the revelation of the concentration camps and the Holocaust, a world trying to convince itself that barbarism had been defeated. Arendt refused such comfort. Her book declared with terrifying clarity that the forces which had birthed Nazism and Stalinism had not disappeared. They had merely changed form. She wrote not as a historian cataloguing horrors, but as someone who had walked through them. The Anatomy of a Nightmare, Arendt dissected totalitarianism with surgical precision. She began not with ideology, but with loneliness, the sense of isolation that modern mass society had created. In the void left by faith, tradition, and community, people became rootless, desperate for belonging. Into that void, totalitarian movements poured their false certainty. She traced how anti-Semitism, imperialism, and bureaucracy laid the groundwork for tyranny. Racism justified domination abroad, bureaucracy made cruelty efficient, ideology gave murder a sense of purpose. Totalitarianism, she argued, was not an eruption of madness, but the logical outcome of a civilization that worshipped order over conscience. It was a system that sought to eliminate spontaneity, individuality, and the unpredictable miracle of human freedom. She wrote, Totalitarianism strives not toward despotic rule over men, but toward a system in which men are superfluous. And the birth of a political thinker. For Arendt, this was not abstract theory, it was personal. She had been among those the system deemed superfluous. She had known what it meant to lose citizenship, to live without the right to have rights. In writing this book, she transformed her suffering into thought. Her exile became her insight. Her statelessness became her lens, through which she saw the modern world more clearly than anyone else. Critics were stunned. Scholars had analyzed fascism and communism as political ideologies. Arendt revealed them as symptoms of a deeper disease, the collapse of the human condition itself. The voice that would not console the book was immense, uncompromising, and unlike anything published before. Readers expecting comfort found only confrontation. Arendt refused to divide the world neatly into monsters and victims. She showed how ordinary people, in their thoughtlessness and obedience, could become the instruments of inhumanity. This refusal to moralize made her controversial. She offered no redemption, no illusions of safety. What terrified her most was not the fanatic, but the bureaucrat, the person who followed orders without thinking. "The sad truth," she wrote, "is that most evil is done by people who never make up their minds to be good or evil." Those words would later become the foundation for her most famous idea, the banality of evil. The reception. The impact of the Origins of Totalitarianism was immediate. Critics hailed it as a masterpiece, though many struggled to categorize it. Was it philosophy, history, or political theory? Arendt shrugged off such distinctions. "I am not a philosopher," she said. "I am a political thinker." The book placed her among the leading intellectuals of post-war America. She began teaching, lecturing, and writing prolifically. But fame brought discomfort. Arendt distrusted the ease with which America turned tragedy into lesson, horror into rhetoric. She warned that forgetting was the first step toward repetition. Her success also brought renewed attention to her past. Old acquaintances from Germany resurfaced. The name Heidegger whispered again through intellectual circles. His silence during the Nazi years, his complicity, his fall from grace. Arendt, now a celebrated analyst of totalitarianism, carried within her the memory of having loved one of its servants. The paradox was unbearable, and yet in her private correspondence, she spoke of him with something like pity rather than hatred. "He remained," she wrote, "a man who did not think what he was doing." That phrase, half judgment, half lament, would one day echo around the world. Freedom and responsibility. In Origins, Arendt argued that totalitarianism did not destroy freedom through force alone. It destroyed the space of thought in which freedom could exist. Once people stopped thinking, stopped judging for themselves, tyranny became inevitable. She insisted that the act of thinking was not an escape from the world, but its highest form of engagement. To think was to resist the machinery of dehumanization. To think was to remain human. Her vision of freedom was radical and fragile. It depended not on laws or institutions, but on the willingness of individuals to speak, to act, to take responsibility. "The moment we no longer have a free press," she wrote, "anything can happen. What makes it possible for a totalitarian system to rule is that people are not informed, they do not think." The new citizen of nowhere. By the early 1950s, Arendt had become an American citizen. Yet even this legal belonging could not erase her identity as an exile. She lived between languages, between continents, between worlds. In this in-between space, she saw truths others missed. Her friends joked that she had become the citizen of nowhere, a title she wore with pride. To her, belonging to no single nation was a form of freedom, a chance to belong to humanity itself. but she knew too well how fragile that humanity was. Her next book, The Human Condition, 1958, would turn from the darkness of tyranny to the possibility of renewal, of rebuilding a political life worthy of the name. In it, she would argue that the true miracle of human existence was not thought, but action, the capacity to begin something new. The woman who had fled Germany stateless was now redefining what it meant to be human in the modern age. But the world she studied so intently would soon confront her again, in the form of a man whose name had become synonymous with horror. Adolf Eichmann, the architect of the Holocaust's logistics. Hannah Arendt would travel to Jerusalem to watch him stand trial, and there she would look directly into the face of evil and find something even more terrifying than hatred. By the mid-1950s, Hannah Arendt had done what few exiles ever manage. She had built a new life without erasing the old one. She was a professor, a respected public intellectual, and a naturalized citizen of the United States. Yet she never stopped feeling that she lived, as she said, on the edge of the world. From that edge, she wrote The Human Condition, 1958, a book that would stand beside the Origins of Totalitarianism as one of the great works of modern political thought. If Origins had dissected the darkness, The Human Condition was an act of rebuilding, a meditation on what it means to live freely among others after the machinery of inhumanity has done its worst. From despair to renewal, Arendt's starting point was simple but devastating. The 20th century had made human beings doubt their own worth. The Holocaust, the atom bomb, and the bureaucratic indifference of modern life had reduced existence to statistics and systems. In a world where technology could annihilate millions at the push of a button, what did it mean to be human? She refused both despair and nostalgia. She rejected the idea that the solution was to retreat into religion or philosophy. Instead, she sought hope in the ordinary acts of living and acting together. The miracle, she wrote, that saves the world, the realm of human affairs, from its normal, natural ruin, is ultimately the fact of natality, the birth of new men, the new beginning inherent in every human being. Birth itself, she argued, was a political event. Every new life carried the potential to begin something unpredictable. Humanity was not saved by power, but by renewal, labor, work, and action. At the heart of the human condition lay a new vision of human activity. Arendt distinguished three realms of life: labor, the endless cycle of necessity, the work of survival, eating, reproducing, toiling; work, the creation of things that endure, buildings, tools, art, institutions; action, the highest form of activity, the creation of meaning through speech, decision, and interaction with others. Action, for Arendt, was what made politics sacred. It was how humans revealed themselves, how they appeared to one another as unique beings. It was the only way to escape anonymity. In the concentration camps, she had seen what happened when action and individuality were destroyed, when humans were turned into numbers. Now she was writing about the opposite, the fragile miracle of being seen, being heard, being remembered. The public and the private Arendt warned that modern society was eroding the distinction between the private world of necessity and the public world of freedom. In the name of comfort and efficiency, citizens had become spectators rather than participants. Television, bureaucracy, and the cult of productivity were turning politics into theater, while real action, spontaneous, unpredictable, courageous, was disappearing. Freedom, she argued, did not mean doing whatever one wanted. True freedom existed only in the presence of others, when individuals met in dialogue, risked disagreement, and built a common world. Power, she wrote, corresponds to the human ability not just to act, but to act in concert. For Arendt, Politics was not the pursuit of control, it was the art of beginning together. A woman among men. When The Human Condition appeared, readers were startled by its voice. Philosophical yet lyrical, it spoke of politics not as a mechanism of domination, but as a living drama of human plurality. It was written by a woman, but it was not about womanhood, it was about the condition of all. Still, the fact of her gender made her a rarity. In the universities of the 1950s, women were almost invisible. Arendt never called herself a feminist in the modern sense, but she lived feminism by example. She refused to apologize for her authority or to soften her intellect. When male colleagues tried to patronize her, she answered with wit and precision. When asked how it felt to be a female philosopher, she replied, "I am not a philosopher. I am a political theorist. And I am not a female mind. I am a mind." The fragility of the human world. In The Human Condition, Arendt returned again and again to the theme of fragility. The human world, she said, exists only through words and deeds. It can vanish when people stop speaking, stop acting, stop caring. Every generation must rebuild it from scratch. Politics, for her, was not about laws or rulers, but about maintaining the fragile space where people appear before each other and say, "I am here." She warned that modern civilization was turning away from this space. Technology, while miraculous, also threatened to sever us from our shared world. Even in 1958, she foresaw the loneliness of the modern individual, surrounded by noise, but starving for genuine encounter. "What makes loneliness so unbearable," she wrote, "is the loss of one's own self, which can be realized only in the trust and presence of others." Hope in action. Yet The Human Condition was not a lament, it was an affirmation. Arendt's message was that freedom is always possible because beginning is always possible. Even after catastrophe, humans retain the power to act anew. She had lived this truth. She had fled tyranny, crossed borders, and begun again in a foreign tongue. She knew that starting over was both agony and grace. Her faith was not in history or progress, but in human initiative, the unpredictable capacity to begin something the world has never seen before. The Seeds of the Next Storm. The book cemented her reputation as one of the most original minds of the post-war world. Universities invited her to lecture. Students gathered to hear her dense but luminous speeches about politics and freedom. But the world she studied so closely was about to confront her with a moral test unlike any other. In 1961, Israeli agents captured Adolf Eichmann, the former SS officer responsible for organizing the logistics of the Holocaust. His trial in Jerusalem drew the attention of the entire world. Hannah Arendt, the refugee who had escaped Germany, the Jew who had written about the machinery of totalitarianism, was asked by The New Yorker to cover the trial. She accepted. She would travel back across the ocean, back into the heart of the 20th century's most unspeakable crime, and stare directly into the face of the man who had made murder administrative. What she would find there would shake her and the world to its core. In 1961, Hannah Arendt, by then one of the most respected political thinkers in the West, boarded a plane to Jerusalem. She was 54 years old, confident, curious, and unprepared for the storm that awaited her. She had been commissioned by the New Yorker magazine to report on the trial of Adolf Eichmann, a former Nazi bureaucrat captured by Israeli agents in Argentina. Eichmann was no ordinary criminal. He was one of the architects of the Holocaust, the man responsible for organizing the trains that carried millions of Jews to their deaths. For Arendt, who had fled Germany and seen the devastation of totalitarianism firsthand, this trial was more than journalism. It was a confrontation with history, morality, and the limits of human understanding. The face of evil. When she entered the courtroom, Arendt expected to see a monster. Instead, she saw a man. Adolf Eichmann did not look like the embodiment of evil. He was small, balding, bespectacled. His posture was awkward, his speech rehearsed and empty. He claimed to have simply followed orders. "I never killed anyone," he said. "I only arranged transportation." He spoke not like a demon, but like a clerk. His German was bureaucratic, lifeless, full of official phrases and cliches. Arendt was struck by how ordinary he seemed. There was no trace of hatred or cruelty in his tone, only mediocrity. She realized, sitting in that courtroom, that something unprecedented had happened in modern history, a crime so vast, committed not by fanatics or sadists, but by men who refused to think. The Banality of Evil, Arendt's dispatches from Jerusalem, would later be published as Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil, 1963. In it, she introduced a phrase that would shake the moral foundations of the modern world: the banality of evil. Evil, she argued, was not always radical or demonic. It could be ordinary, thoughtless, even bureaucratic. Eichmann's great crime was not monstrous intelligence, but a terrifying absence of thought. He had obeyed orders without reflection, performed atrocities as though they were administrative duties. The trouble with Eichmann, she wrote, was precisely that so many were like him, and that the many were neither perverted nor sadistic, but terrifyingly normal. This insight was not a defense, it was an accusation. Arendt was warning that the capacity for evil lay not in a few psychopaths, but in everyone who surrendered their judgment to authority. The firestorm. The reaction was explosive. Many Jewish leaders, survivors, and intellectuals accused her of cruelty, arrogance, and betrayal. They claimed she had portrayed Eichmann too sympathetically, that she had insulted the memory of the dead by calling evil banal. Her depiction of certain Jewish councils who had cooperated with Nazi administrators under duress provoked particular outrage. Arendt's suggestion that their compliance, however tragic, had facilitated deportations was taken as an unforgivable offense. She received hate mail, public denunciations, and lost friendships that had lasted decades. Her mentor, Karl Jaspers, warned her of the storm, but admired her courage. Others turned their backs completely. Even the philosopher Gershom Scholem, once a close friend, accused her of lacking love for the Jewish people. Arendt replied with calm ferocity, "I have never in my life loved any people or collective. I indeed love only my friends." That reply, more than any other, revealed her uncompromising independence. She would not allow loyalty or sentiment to replace thought. The cost of truth. The controversy over Eichmann in Jerusalem consumed her for years. Critics misunderstood her, enemies misquoted her, admirers struggled to defend her. But Arendt refused to retreat. She had seen too clearly what happens when people stop thinking for themselves. She clarified, again and again, calling evil banal did not mean it was trivial. It meant that it was empty, committed by people who had abdicated the responsibility to judge. Eichmann was not a monster because monstrosity would have absolved everyone else. His mediocrity was precisely what made him terrifying. It was as though in those last minutes he was summing up the lesson that this long course in human wickedness had taught us, she wrote. The lesson of the fearsome, word and thought-defying banality of evil. The solitude of judgment. In the years after the book's publication, Arendt found herself increasingly isolated. Many of her old friends in the Jewish and intellectual communities distanced themselves. She felt betrayed, but she also understood. To tell the truth in dark times, she said, is to invite loneliness. Yet she was not alone. Her students adored her, drawn to her fierce intelligence and her refusal to flatter anyone, including herself. She taught that thinking was a moral act, that judgment was the essence of humanity. Her lectures, often delivered in thickly accented English, were electrifying. She spoke without notes, pacing slowly, her sentences coiling into paradoxes and clarity. She taught not dogma, but courage. The courage to think in public, to resist conformity, to remain human in the face of systems that would turn us into cogs. After the fire. The storm surrounding Eichmann in Jerusalem eventually quieted, but Arendt's reputation never fully recovered in some circles. Yet her influence only grew. The phrase banality of evil entered the moral vocabulary of the modern world, appearing in classrooms, courtrooms, and headlines. It remains one of the most haunting phrases ever written, precisely because it is so easy to misunderstand. Arendt's insight was not about Eichmann alone, it was about us. It was a warning that evil will always reappear wherever thoughtlessness reigns, wherever people exchange moral judgment for obedience, wherever they allow clichés to replace conscience. The trial in Jerusalem had not only shown her the face of a bureaucrat, it had shown her the mirror of humanity itself. Thinking without banisters. After the trial, Hannah Arendt began to speak of thinking without banisters, a metaphor for a life without handrails, without dogma or ideology. To think freely, she said, is to walk unprotected, exposed to the world as it is. Her courage in doing so made her one of the most radical moral voices of her age. She had turned philosophy into witness, intellect into conscience, and yet, for all her insight into the evil of the world, Hannah remained haunted by the figure who had once awakened her mind. The man who had chosen silence when she chose speech, complicity when she chose exile. Soon as the century neared its end, she would confront him one last time, not in passion or forgiveness, but in the quiet of old age, as two thinkers bound forever by the mystery of thought and the weight of history. The year was 1963. Eichmann in Jerusalem had been published, and its shockwaves were still spreading through every intellectual circle in Europe and America. Hannah Arendt, once the voice of conscience for a post-war generation, was now being denounced as arrogant, unfeeling, and even traitorous. The irony was cruel. The woman who had risked her life escaping the Nazis was now accused by her own people of betraying their memory. The philosopher of freedom had become a heretic in the court of public opinion. The firestorm letters poured into newspapers and journals, full of outrage. Former friends cut her off without explanation. Even the New Yorker, which had commissioned her report, was besieged by complaints. Universities whispered about cancelling her lectures. Invitations disappeared. The intellectual community split sharply in two. Some called her book a masterpiece of moral courage. Others called it monstrous. Her critics misunderstood her profoundly, but perhaps inevitably. To them, calling evil banal sounded like minimizing it. To Arendt, it meant something far more disturbing, that evil could be committed without hatred, without thought, without motive at all. This insight that ordinary people could become agents of catastrophe simply by refusing to think was too painful for many to accept. It demanded that every reader ask themselves how far they would go in obedience, how easily they could be absorbed by the machinery of authority. The price of clarity. Arendt refused to defend herself in public debates. Explanations, she said, would only make things worse. Instead, she remained silent in the newspapers, but spoke quietly in letters to friends. She told one correspondent, "My only crime is that I try to see with my own eyes and think with my own mind." She had spent her life cultivating independence. Now she would pay the price for it. In private, the attacks wounded her deeply. She felt betrayed by colleagues she had admired. People who had once praised her for the origins of totalitarianism now accused her of lacking empathy, of being cold and heartless. One reviewer even described her as the ice queen of philosophy. Now, but those who knew her personally saw a different woman, warm, witty, prone to laughter, loyal to her students, and intensely human. The public image of the severe intellectual was only half true. Behind the cool exterior was a woman exhausted by the pain of being misunderstood, a thinker under siege. In her seminars, she refused to discuss the controversy. Instead, she turned her lectures toward the nature of judgment. She asked her students, "What does it mean to judge rightly when the world itself has gone mad?" To think, she told them, was not enough. Thought must culminate in judgment, a capacity rooted in empathy, imagination, and courage. She urged them to resist what she called the thoughtlessness of the many. Her words carried the quiet authority of someone who had seen where that thoughtlessness leads. The sad truth, she reminded them, is that most people would rather obey than think. Students left her classes shaken but inspired. She had turned her own public condemnation into a lesson about the moral loneliness of truth, friends and foes. Among those who defended her was Karl Jaspers, her old mentor and dearest friend. He wrote to her, "You have seen deeper than most. The world will need your courage, though it may not thank you for it." But even his letters carried a note of sorrow. He worried that she had chosen the path of isolation too absolutely, that her independence had become armor too heavy to remove, and in truth, Arendt was growing more solitary. The intellectual world that had once celebrated her now seemed small, petty, afraid. She withdrew into her teaching, her writing, and her closest friendships. One of those friendships, paradoxically, was with Mary McCarthy, an American novelist and essayist who admired Arendt's fearlessness. McCarthy became her confidant, the person with whom she could joke, rage, and laugh again. Their letters would later reveal Arendt's humor, her vulnerability, and her refusal to play the role of victim. "Let them hate," she once wrote to McCarthy. "At least they have to think first." The return of the past. Even as she faced public condemnation, Arendt's private life took an unexpected turn. She renewed contact with Martin Heidegger, the man whose silence and betrayal had once broken her heart. Decades had passed since their affair in Marburg. The war was over. Heidegger had been disgraced for his Nazi involvement. Yet Arendt, now world-famous and untouchable, wrote to him with a strange tenderness. She did not excuse his choices, but she could not erase what he had once been to her. Their correspondence, later published, shows two aging minds circling each other like shadows, both marked by guilt, memory, and the burden of thought. To many, her willingness to reconcile with him seemed incomprehensible. But for Arendt, forgiveness was not absolution. It was a recognition of the complexity of being human, the refusal to reduce anyone, even the guilty, to a single act. Her life had taught her that simplifications were the first step toward tyranny. The woman who would not bend. By the late 1960s, the storm began to subside. The world moved on, but Arendt remained firm in her belief that moral clarity demands solitude. She gave interviews occasionally, her tone calm, almost amused. "I never meant to shock anyone," she said once, smiling faintly. "I only tried to describe what I saw." Her composure infuriated her critics and fascinated her admirers. To some, she was a prophet, to others, an enigma. But to her students and readers, she was something rarer, a person who refused to lie even to herself. The quiet of understanding. In the decade that followed, Hannah Arendt continued to write and teach. Her later essays on politics, education, and moral responsibility deepened her reputation as a thinker who could see both the fragility and the promise of human freedom. She knew, however, that she would never escape controversy. The price of truth, she often said, is loneliness. But that loneliness no longer frightened her. It had become her home. She had been stateless, exiled, betrayed, adored, condemned, and yet she remained herself. Hannah Arendt's defiance was not loud or theatrical. It was quiet, steady, rooted in the belief that the act of thinking, truly thinking, is the last sanctuary of human dignity. And as the world that once rejected her slowly began to understand her, she turned her gaze once more toward the question that haunted her life. What does it mean to forgive without forgetting? That question would define her final years, her reconciliation with Heidegger, her reflections on love, friendship, and mortality, and her calm acceptance of the end that comes for all thinkers. By the 1970s, Hannah Arendt had become a paradox, a woman once reviled, now revered, a thinker once accused of arrogance, now quoted as the conscience of her age. The storms that had followed Eichmann in Jerusalem had quieted, but the scars remained. She had learned to live not for approval, but for truth. From her modest apartment on Riverside Drive in New York, overlooking the Hudson River, she continued to write and teach, her accent still thick, her voice firm but gentle. Her hair, streaked with gray, framed eyes that had seen both the heights of intellect and the depths of evil. She had survived wars, betrayals, and exile, and yet she still believed in the fragile miracle of freedom. Thinking and acting. In her later years, Arendt began to refine what had become the central axis of her life's philosophy, the relationship between thinking and acting. She believed that all the disasters of the 20th century, the totalitarian regimes, the genocides, the bureaucratic indifference, had stemmed from one profound human failure: the refusal to think. To think, for Arendt, was not merely to analyze. It was to examine one's conscience, to hear the silent dialogue within oneself that asks, "What am I doing?" Eichmann had failed precisely because he had never asked that question. But thought alone, she warned, was not enough. Thinking must lead to action, to appear in the world, to speak, to begin. The freedom she defended was not the freedom of isolation, but the freedom of participation, the capacity to shape the shared world through words and deeds. Freedom, she wrote, is not a possession, it is a practice. The courage to begin. Arendt saw in every act of genuine political engagement a form of rebirth. She called this capacity natality, the power to start something new. Even after all she had witnessed, she insisted that humanity was not doomed to repeat its horrors. So long as one person dared to act differently, history could change course. She often reminded her students that despair was a form of laziness, that cynicism was only the cowardice of those who refused responsibility. The antidote, she said, was courage. The courage to speak when others are silent, to think when others obey, to begin when others surrender. Her lectures in those years had the atmosphere of moral awakening. She stood before young faces, many of whom had grown up after the war, and told them that freedom was not guaranteed, that every generation must win it again through action and judgment. The world will not get better, she told them, if we merely wait for it to do so. It will get better only when we take the risk of acting in it. The teacher of thought. At the New School for Social Research in New York, and later at the University of Chicago, Arendt's classes became legendary. She spoke without notes, walking slowly back and forth, pausing between sentences as though wrestling with the weight of her own ideas. Her students did not simply learn theory, they learned how to think. Many described her presence as electrifying. She could dissect Plato and then, in the next breath, connect him to the morning newspaper. She refused to create disciples. Think for yourself, she told them again and again. Don't agree with me, understand me, and then go further. This was her version of intellectual freedom, not indoctrination, but awakening, forgiveness and judgment. In her final essays, especially those collected in The Life of the Mind, Arendt explored what she called the faculty of judgment. If thought was the inner conversation of the soul, judgment was its voice in the world. The ability to discern good from evil without relying on rules, ideologies, or authorities. Judgment, she wrote, was the bridge between philosophy and politics. It was what prevented human beings from becoming instruments of systems. It was the quiet act of conscience that said, "This I will do, and this I will not." But she also wrote of something even rarer: forgiveness. Forgiveness, she believed, was the only human power that could break the chain of vengeance and allow new beginnings. To forgive was not to forget, but to refuse the tyranny of the past. Forgiving, she wrote, is the only reaction which does not merely react, but acts anew and unexpectedly, unconditioned by the act which provoked it. Her own life embodied this paradox. She had forgiven Heidegger, not to absolve him, but to free herself from hatred. In that act, she demonstrated the moral independence she had spent her entire career defending, the weight of mortality. Arendt's health began to decline in the early 1970s. She smoked constantly, drank black coffee through long nights of writing, and rarely rested. Her husband, Heinrich Blücher, had died in 1970, a loss that left her hollow but not broken. "He was my other voice," she said quietly, "and now I must speak alone." Her final years were marked by reflection, by a kind of luminous exhaustion. Friends described visiting her apartment and finding her surrounded by books, a cigarette in hand, a cat purring by the window, papers spread across the table. She spoke often of death, but without fear. To her, mortality was not tragedy, it was what made human life precious. "We are born," she once wrote, "so that we may begin, and we die so that others may begin after us." Recognition. Before her death, Arendt finally received the recognition she had never sought. Awards, honorary degrees, and lectureships poured in from universities around the world. The same intellectual establishment that had once condemned her now celebrated her as a prophet of conscience, but she remained wary of praise. "It is dangerous to become an institution," she told a friend. "Institutions stop thinking." Her fame meant little compared to her faith in the solitary act of reflection, the inner dialogue that no crowd could share. Even at 70, she continued to write about the world as if it could still be renewed. Her last unfinished manuscript, The Life of the Mind, explored three human capacities: thinking, willing, and judging. She completed only the first two before death claimed her. The final pages end abruptly, with a sentence trailing off mid-thought, as if she had simply paused to breathe before the next idea. The final lesson. On December 4th, 1975, Hannah Arendt died suddenly of a heart attack in her apartment in New York. She was 70. On her desk lay the last page of The Life of the Mind, and beside it an open book by Immanuel Kant. It felt somehow fitting. The woman who had devoted her life to thinking died in the act of it. Her students and friends gathered for a quiet memorial, reading her favorite line from her essay on action, "No one has the right to obey." That phrase, stark and defiant, encapsulated her life. She had obeyed no ideology, no nation, no authority, only the demands of conscience and the dignity of thought. But even in death, her influence would not fade. The world she had spent her life warning against, thoughtless, mechanical, unfree, was still very much alive. And her words, luminous and unsettling, would continue to challenge generations to come. She had given philosophy back its humanity and politics back its soul. The refugee from Königsberg had become the philosopher of freedom, and her question still hangs over every age that follows. When the world demands silence, will we dare to think? To understand Hannah Arendt, one must understand that for her, thinking was never detached from feeling. Her intellect was immense, yes, but beneath it burned an emotional depth that shaped every word she wrote. Even when she appeared stoic, her life was marked by passion, the passion for truth, for friendship, and for the love that refused to die, no matter how compromised or impossible it became. And nowhere was this more evident than in her enduring lifelong entanglement with Martin Heidegger, the man who had both awakened and betrayed her. The return of the ghost. 3 decades had passed since their affair in Marburg, the forbidden romance between the young Jewish student and the brilliant married professor who would later pledge allegiance to the Nazi regime. After the war, Heidegger had been disgraced, banned from teaching for years because of his political complicity. Many of his peers turned their backs on him. He retreated into silence, living in isolation in his cabin in the Black Forest. And then, in the early 1950s, a letter arrived. It was from Hannah. She was famous now, an author, a thinker of global renown. He was a relic, an outcast philosopher trying to justify his silence. Yet, when she wrote to him, she did not write as a judge or an accuser. Her words were precise, formal, and tinged with something both tender and merciless. "What you did cannot be undone," she told him, "but I still know what you once were." The correspondence resumed. Slowly, cautiously, 2 voices long separated by history began to speak again. Their letters, collected after their deaths, reveal not reconciliation but recognition, a dialogue between 2 souls bound by intellect and memory who had seen opposite sides of human failure. Forgiveness without forgetting. Hannah did not excuse Heidegger's allegiance to Nazism, but she refused to let hatred define her. She once told a friend, "To understand is not to forgive. It is simply the condition of any human relationship with the past." This was her quiet revolution, her refusal to surrender to vengeance. Forgiveness, for her, was not absolution. It was an act of freedom. It released her from being chained to what had already happened. It allowed her to keep living, to keep thinking, without being consumed by resentment. Heidegger, for his part, never fully apologized. His silence about the Holocaust remained to her a wound that never healed. Yet she continued to visit him on occasion, sometimes with her husband, Heinrich Blücher. They walked in the forest, spoke of philosophy, and shared the strange bond of 2 exiles of conscience, one self-imposed, one forced. In one of her final letters to him, she wrote, "We are both from the time before. We think in ways the world no longer recognizes." It was not love reborn. It was love transfigured, purified by sorrow and distance. The solitude of the thinker. After Blücher's death in 1970, Arendt entered a deep solitude. For decades, he had been her equal companion, the man who believed in her when the world turned hostile, who never feared her brilliance. His absence was an ache that words could not touch, but solitude for Arendt was never loneliness. It was the condition of thought itself. She wrote that to think, one must learn to be alone, to hold conversation with oneself without fleeing. She distinguished solitude from isolation. Isolation, she said, is the desert of the soul. Solitude is its garden. In those final years, she found herself surrounded by younger students and admirers who sought her wisdom. They brought her flowers, helped her with errands, recorded her lectures. But when the evenings came, she was content to sit by her window, the river beyond, a cigarette glowing between her fingers, and the hum of the city below. She would reread her favorite poets, Rilke, Hölderlin, and Auden. The line she returned to most often was one she had once quoted in a lecture, "We must love one another or die." But she added softly, "Love, too, must be free." Belonging nowhere, Arendt often said she was a pariah by choice. She belonged to no nation, No ideology, no collective. She had fled Germany, been interned in France, found refuge in America, but home for her was nowhere and everywhere. In one interview, she was asked whether she felt more German, Jewish, or American. She laughed, a low, amused laugh that revealed both pride and fatigue, and replied, "I am human. That should be enough." This self-chosen exile was both armor and philosophy. To be at home everywhere, she said, one must learn to be at home nowhere. Her homelessness became her strength. It kept her free from the illusions that trap those who cling too tightly to belonging. And yet, there was melancholy in that freedom. She envied no one, but she missed the warmth of roots, the feeling of speaking one's mother tongue among one's own people. German remained the language of her heart, though she rarely admitted it. English, her adopted language, was the language of her reason. Between them, she lived her life suspended, half longing, half liberty. The fragile beauty of the world. In her solitude, she began to reflect more deeply on the fragility of the human world. The 1970s were an age of cynicism, corruption, and renewed violence. Arendt saw in it echoes of the past, the same weariness that had once driven nations into the arms of tyrants. She warned, again and again, that the loss of trust in politics, the flight into conformity, and the indifference of citizens were the seeds of future catastrophe. The death of politics, she wrote, comes when people no longer believe that acting together can change anything. But she did not despair. She believed that even in ruins, human beings could build anew. She had seen it happen in her own life, after every collapse, after Germany, after exile, after war. Freedom, she said, was not a promise. It was a practice. And the ability to begin again was the only proof that we were still human. The last letters. Her correspondence with Heidegger continued almost until her death. Their final letters, exchanged in the mid-1970s, are haunting in their restraint. Two old souls, once lovers and now strangers, joined by memory, writing about the beauty of trees, the silence of snow, the persistence of thought. In one of his last letters, Heidegger wrote to her, "In thinking of you, the old paths return." She never replied. Perhaps because there was nothing left to say. In her final years, Hannah Arendt lived exactly as she had always believed one should, without illusions, without bitterness, and without surrender. She had been the stateless, the heretic, the exile, and in all those forms she had remained free. And when her death came in 1975, it found her not afraid, not unprepared, but still thinking, still wrestling with the question that had followed her all her life. What does it mean to remain human when the world forgets humanity? On the evening of December 4th, 1975, the lights of New York City shimmered on the Hudson, and Hannah Arendt sat at her desk as she had done 1,000 times before, books open, cigarette smoke curling in the lamplight, her pen poised above a page of unfinished thought. She was writing the final section of her last great work, The Life of the Mind, when her heart suddenly failed. Death came quietly, without struggle, like a punctuation mark at the end of a long, deliberate sentence. When her friends found her, the manuscript lay open before her. The final line, written in her careful hand, broke off mid-sentence. On her desk sat a volume of Immanuel Kant's Critique of Judgment, the book she had been studying as she explored the nature of moral judgment, the faculty she believed was all that stood between humanity and catastrophe. It was as though she had been thinking until her very last breath. A quiet farewell. Hannah Arendt was 70 years old. The woman who had been exiled, reviled, celebrated and misunderstood in equal measure, was gone. Her funeral, held in New York City, was modest and unpretentious, exactly as she would have wanted. Friends, colleagues, and students gathered not to mourn, but to think. They read aloud her own words. There are no dangerous thoughts. Thinking itself is dangerous. The danger she meant was not destruction, but awakening, the risk of seeing the world without illusion, of daring to ask the questions that others feared to utter. Her ashes were interred beside her husband, Heinrich Blücher, at Bard College in Annandale-on-Hudson, the campus where she had once taught and walked under autumn leaves with her students. There was no monument, no grand memorial, only the silence of the river and the whisper of trees, a fitting resting place for the woman who believed that thought, not fame, was the only true immortality. The life she lived. In the years that followed her death, her ideas began to spread more powerfully than they ever had during her life. Scholars, feminists, political theorists, and dissidents from across the world rediscovered her writings. The Origins of Totalitarianism was translated into dozens of languages. The human condition became a cornerstone of political philosophy, and Eichmann in Jerusalem, once reviled, was read in classrooms as a warning to every generation. Her face, once the symbol of controversy, became the emblem of intellectual courage. Her sentences, precise, haunting, and mercilessly clear, returned to the public consciousness like echoes from the future. The sad truth, she had written, is that most evil is done by people who never make up their minds to be good or evil. In the decades that followed, as new forms of propaganda, authoritarianism, and mass conformity appeared around the world, those words felt less like a lesson from the past and more like prophecy. The enduring mirror. Hannah Arendt's genius was not in offering comfort, but in forcing humanity to look at itself. She never sought to be loved, she sought to be understood, and she understood, more clearly than anyone, that the gravest threat to civilization was not violence, but thoughtlessness. Her phrase, "the banality of evil," became one of the defining ideas of the modern world. It revealed that evil does not require hatred or madness. It thrives wherever obedience replaces conscience, wherever slogans replace reflection, wherever people prefer to avoid the burden of judgment. She once said, "The moment you think, you stop being obedient." That was her creed, her rebellion, and her faith. A woman beyond labels. In her lifetime, Arendt had resisted every label. She refused to call herself a philosopher, though she shaped modern philosophy. She refused to call herself a feminist, though her life embodied feminism's deepest ideals. She was Jewish, but refused to be confined by identity politics. She was German, yet rejected nationalism. She lived in the tension between worlds, belonging to none, yet illuminating all. Her very existence was an act of defiance against categorization. For Hannah Arendt, the purpose of thought was not to build systems, but to keep the world open, to prevent the closure of meaning that leads to tyranny. Her thinking was not meant to comfort, it was meant to disturb. "Thinking," she wrote, "does not yield any positive results. It is like the wind. It leaves no trace, but it clears the air." That, perhaps, was her greatest legacy. She cleared the air of the 20th century, allowing others to breathe again. The legacy of freedom. In our own time, when truth is again distorted, when obedience often masquerades as virtue, when technology reduces people to data, Hannah Arendt's voice feels eerily present. She reminds us that freedom is not granted. It must be renewed by each act of courage, each refusal to lie, each decision to think. Her ideas echo wherever people resist authoritarianism, wherever individuals stand against the mass, wherever conscience survives conformity. She taught that political action begins not with revolution, but with the humble act of speaking truthfully in public. That is how freedom is born, and how it dies when silence prevails. "What I propose," she once said, "is very simple. It is nothing more than to think what we are doing. The eternal return of thought. Decades after her death, Arendt's words have found new life. Her image adorns murals in Berlin and New York. Her books are read by activists in Hong Kong, students in Tehran, and philosophers in Paris. Her voice crosses borders as easily as she once did. She stands now not as a symbol of ideology, but as a reminder that the world can only survive if we remain capable of judgment, if we remain willing to think. In her final book, The Life of the Mind, she wrote what could serve as her epitaph: "No thought is safe, no life without risk." To think is to live dangerously. Hannah Arendt lived dangerously. She thought when others obeyed, spoke when others were silent, and forgave when others could not. She had no homeland, yet she gave the world back its moral compass. And so her story ends as it began, with a woman standing alone, refusing silence, her mind alight against the gathering dark. The girl who refused to be silent became the thinker who refused to stop. Her question still echoes today. When obedience becomes easier than thought, who will dare to think?